This is the Orion stalker, a species capable of shredding reinforced titanium with its bare claws, a creature that has emptied entire colonies in a single night. But right now, in a nursery on the frontier world of Halcyon's Rest, it is kneeling on the floor, offering a chewed rubber toy to a 3-year-old girl who has just told it very firmly that it is doing the puzzle wrong. How does the single most feared predator in the Orion Reach end up here? Let's find out. Before we get to the nursery, you need to understand exactly what was walking into it. The species colonists call the Skitter-Wight, its actual designation in the Xenobiology Consolidated Registry, is Kralathex vorenmalu, but nobody who has ever seen one alive uses that name twice, is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most efficient killing machines cataloged in known space. An adult Skitter-Wight stands roughly 2.5 meters at the shoulder when fully upright, though it rarely stands fully upright. Its preferred hunting posture is a low, coiled crouch that lets it cover 11 meters in a single explosive launch. Its exoskeleton is a layered chitin metal composite, grown rather than secreted, dense enough that early colonial security teams on the frontier world of Thessaly's Hollow discovered, at considerable cost, that standard-issue sidearms simply bounced off it. Its forelimbs terminate in a paired set of sickle-shaped mandibular claws capable, according to a now infamous stress test conducted by the Kestrel Consortium's Materials Lab, of shearing through 11 millimeters of reinforced titanium plating in under 4 seconds. Its hunting vision operates almost entirely in the infrared spectrum, supplemented by a secondary echolocation sense that lets it track prey through total darkness, through smoke, through the kind of dust storms that ground every aircraft on a colony world. It does not need to see you to find you. It needs only to know that you are warm and that you are afraid, because fear, as any xenobiologist who has survived a field encounter will tell you, has a chemical signature the Skitter-Wight can taste on the air from nearly a kilometer away. For the better part of 4 decades, the Skitter-Wight held the dubious honor of topping the Frontier Colonial Safety Board's threat registry, a list updated annually, and feared universally by anyone whose job required them to set foot outside a colony's perimeter fence. The species was responsible, directly or indirectly, for the evacuation of 6 separate frontier settlements, the deaths of at least 300 confirmed colonists, and an entire subgenre of frontier folklore in which the phrase, "the whites got your scent," became shorthand for, "You have made a terrible mistake, and there is no correcting it now." Colonial safety training on every frontier world within the Reach devoted an entire mandatory module to Skitter-Wight avoidance, drilled into every new arrival before they were permitted to so much as set foot beyond a settlement's perimeter fence, unsupervised. The training was blunt to the point of brutality, precisely because the consequences of underestimating the species had, historically, been so severe, never run, because a Skitter-Wight's pursuit instinct triggers on fleeing motion with near-perfect reliability. Never mask fear with aggression, because the species reads bluffing postures as a challenge rather than a deterrent. And above all, never assume distance equals safety, because a resting Skitter-Wight can close a 100-meter gap in under 9 seconds from a standing start. Colonists who violated any of these 3 rules did not, as a rule, survive to describe the experience in detail, and the handful who had were treated on every frontier world where their stories circulated, with the particular hushed reverence usually reserved for people who have looked directly at something the rest of the species would prefer to only ever encounter in a safety briefing. The species' reproductive and social biology, meanwhile, remained frustratingly poorly understood for decades, precisely because studying a Skitter-Wight closely enough to document its behavior in detail required a level of proximity that no researcher had ever survived attempting. What little was known came almost entirely from remote observation, drone footage captured from a cautious distance, thermal imaging of den sites abandoned long before any human dared approach them, and the grim, fragmentary evidence recovered from the handful of encounters that had ended in a colonist's death rather than a colonist's narrow escape. The species was known to be solitary outside of a brief mating season, known to maintain fiercely defended individual hunting territories that could span dozens of kilometers, and known, from the handful of den sites that had ever been examined after the fact, to invest an extraordinary, almost disproportionate amount of parental care in a single offspring at a time, a detail that had been logged, catalogued, and then largely set aside as a biological curiosity. Its true significance entirely unrecognized until a 3-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat rendered it suddenly, urgently relevant. Dr. Amara Kessler-Namdi, the xenobiologist who would later become the single most important human witness to everything that follows in this story, spent the first 6 years of her career studying the species from a comfortable, professionally appropriate distance: drone footage, remote sensor logs, the occasional recovered carcass. She has said, in interviews since, that she never once expected to study one from 4 feet away, watching it hold impossibly still while a toddler tried to braid a length of yarn into the bristles along its jaw. Everything we knew about the Skitter-Wight, Dr. Kessler-Namdi would later testify before the Colonial Xenobiology Oversight Committee, told us it was a solitary apex predator with zero documented tolerance for proximity to warm-blooded life it did not intend to kill. We had 40 years of data supporting that conclusion. And then a 3-year-old walked into a supply shed on Halcyon's Rest, and 40 years of data stopped mattering. Halcyon's Rest was, by frontier standards, an unremarkable colony. One of 19 agricultural settlements strung along the temperate belt of a moon called Verity, chosen for its rich, unusually stable soil and its near-total absence of the geological instability that plagued its neighboring worlds. It had a population of just under 4,000, a single school, a modest medical center, and a perimeter fence that had, until the events of that spring, never once been breached by anything larger than a scavenging pack of native brush runners. Mila Whitcomb Osei was 3 years old, the youngest child of Daniel Whitcomb Osei, the colony's chief agricultural engineer, and Farai Whitcomb Osei, who ran the settlement's only bakery and was, by unanimous local agreement, responsible for the best sourdough within 4 systems. Mila was, by every account her parents and neighbors would later give, a determined, curious, and thoroughly unstoppable child, the kind of toddler who treated every closed door as a personal challenge, and every "stay where I can see you" as a suggestion open to negotiation. On the afternoon in question, Farai had left Mila in the care of her older brother, an 11-year-old named Kwame, for approximately 4 minutes while she pulled a batch of bread from the oven. 4 minutes, it turned out, was exactly long enough for Mila to slip out through the bakery's rear supply door, cross the narrow service alley behind the building, and wander into the colony's agricultural storage shed, a squat, half-buried structure used to house surplus grain, and, on that particular week, a very large problem the colony's security team had not yet found a way to solve. Farai Whitcomb Osei, for her part, would later say that those 4 minutes were the only 4 minutes of her life she has ever genuinely wished she could take back and live differently. Not because she blamed herself for what happened exactly, but because she has never since been able to fully separate the smell of fresh sourdough from the memory of running out through that same rear supply door, flour still on her hands, certain she was about to find the worst thing a parent can find. "I have baked that same bread every week for 11 years since," she told the documentary crew. "I have never once been able to pull it from the oven without checking first that I know exactly where my daughter is." 3 days earlier, a Skitter-Wight had been discovered inside the perimeter fence, badly injured. One of its 4 hind limbs mangled almost past recognition in what field investigators would later determine was a fall into an abandoned mining shaft, roughly 2 kilometers from the settlement. It had dragged itself on the remaining 3 limbs, the entire distance to the storage shed. Likely, Dr. Kessler-Namdi would later theorize, drawn by the shed's relative warmth and the absence of any obvious threat inside it, and had simply collapsed there, too weakened by blood loss and infection to move any farther. The colony's security chief, a broad, no-nonsense veteran named Otieno Vasquez Lindqvist, had wanted to put the creature down the moment it was found. That was, by any reasonable colonial safety protocol, the correct call. A wounded apex predator inside a settlement's perimeter was not a rescue situation. It was a hazard requiring immediate, decisive elimination. He was overruled, not by policy, but by circumstance. The colony's single perimeter defense turret had jammed the same week, its targeting array corrupted by a software fault nobody had yet diagnosed, and the only 2 colonists licensed to operate heavy plasma equipment were off-world on a supply run that wouldn't return for another 6 days. Vasquez Lindqvist made the only call available to him: seal the shed, post a guard, and wait for either the creature to die of its wounds or the supply run to return with someone who could finish the job properly. The guard posted outside the shed that afternoon was on a break, refilling his water canteen at a pump 40 meters away, when a 3-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat pushed open a service door that had been left, through nobody's particular fault, unlatched. What happened inside the storage shed over the following 11 minutes exists, in official Colonial Safety Board records, as a single terse incident report. What actually happened, reconstructed later from the shed's damaged internal sensor logs, from Mila's own halting 3-year-old account and from Dr. Kessler Namdi's subsequent behavioral analysis, was something considerably stranger. Mila Whitcomb-Osei walked into a dim, grain-dusty storage shed looking, by her own later explanation, for the kitty that Kwame said was hiding. She found instead an 800-kilogram apex predator collapsed against a stack of grain sacks, its mandibular claws capable of shearing through reinforced titanium, hanging slack and motionless at its sides, its infrared-sensitive eyes tracking her slow, unafraid approach with an intensity that any adult witness would have correctly read as the final seconds before a fatal attack. The Skitter-Wight did not attack. According to the partial sensor log later recovered from the shed's damaged camera, audio only for the first 6 minutes, the visual feed knocked offline by the creature's earlier collapse, Mila approached to within arm's reach of the wounded animal, sat down cross-legged on the dusty floor directly in front of it, and began, in the specific, uninterruptible narrative style of a 3-year-old, to tell it about her day. "You're hurt," she informed it according to the recovered audio. "Kwame gets hurt too. He falls off his bike a lot. Mama puts the orange stuff on it and it stings, but then it's better." A pause, filled with the shuffle of small hands moving closer. "Does the orange stuff work on you?" There was no orange stuff. There was instead a small, battered rubber toy, a chewed, faded yellow duck that Mila had apparently been carrying in her raincoat pocket since breakfast, which she produced and held out, with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a toddler certain that any problem can be solved by the correct application of a favorite toy. What happened next is the moment Dr. Kessler Namdi would spend the next 4 years of her career trying to fully explain, and the moment that would eventually rewrite an entire section of the Xenobiology Consolidated Registry's behavioral notes on Kralathex voronmalu, the Skitter-Wight, an animal that had killed at least 11 confirmed humans over the previous decade, and had never once in 40 years of documented observation tolerated close proximity to a warm-blooded creature it did not intend to kill, lowered its enormous mandible-lined head, slowly with the deliberate controlled care of something that understood, on some level, exactly how much damage a single careless movement could do, and gently, impossibly, closed its jaws around the offered toy. It did not bite down. It held the duck the way a house cat might carry a kitten by the scruff, with a precision that required the animal to override, moment by moment, every mechanism its jaw had ever evolved for. And then, with what the recovered footage's audio analyst would later describe, cautiously as a low, rhythmic clicking vocalization never previously documented in any Skitter-Wight field recording, it set the toy gently down on the floor between them. Mila laughed. She picked the duck back up, held it out again. The Skitter-Wight took it again, just as carefully, and set it down again. By the time Otieno Vasquez Lindqvist finished his water break, returned to his post, and discovered the shed door standing open, he found himself looking through the doorway at a 3-year-old girl, playing an uncomplicated game of fetch with the single most dangerous documented predator in the Orion Reach. "I have replayed that moment more times than I can count," Vasquez Lindqvist said later, in the same oversight committee testimony that would eventually put this incident into official galactic record. "Every instinct I had told me to open fire immediately. Safety of the child be damned, because a slow response was more likely to get her killed than a fast one. And then the creature looked directly at me. I want to be clear, its head turned. Its eyes tracked me. It absolutely registered me as a threat entering its space. and instead of reacting the way 40 years of behavioral data said it should, it very deliberately positioned its own body between me and the child. It wasn't guarding the toy. It was guarding her. In the days that followed, as news of the encounter spread first through the colony and then, inevitably, through the wider frontier colonial network, the question on everyone's mind was the same one Vasquez Lindqvist had been asking himself in that doorway. Why? Dr. Amara Kessler-Namdi arrived on Halcyon's Rest 31 hours after the initial encounter, having dropped every other project on her research schedule the moment the incident report crossed her desk. What she found, upon arrival, was a colony administration paralyzed by an impossible dilemma. A wounded, immensely dangerous predator that every safety protocol demanded be euthanized immediately, currently occupying a storage shed that a 3-year-old girl had already, against every parental instruction issued in the intervening day, attempted to sneak back into on 4 separate occasions. The moment I saw the footage, Dr. Kessler-Namdi later wrote in her field journal, an excerpt of which would eventually be published in the Consolidated Xenobiology Quarterly, I understood we weren't looking at an aberration. We were looking at a behavioral pathway nobody had ever thought to test for, because nobody had ever put a Skitter-Wight in a room with something it could not possibly perceive as prey, competition, or threat. Her working theory, refined over the following months into what would eventually become the foundational paper on what the field now calls cross-species Denning response, or more informally, the Halcyon effect, centered on a specific evolutionary quirk of the Skitter-Wight's reproductive biology that had been documented for decades, but never fully connected to its behavior around potential prey. Skitter-Wight young, it turned out, were born in a state of near-total helplessness, blind, limbless for the first several weeks of development, entirely dependent on a single parent for warmth, protection, and feeding. This period of extreme vulnerability had produced, over millions of years of evolutionary pressure, an intensely specific and intensely powerful parental instinct, one triggered not by visual recognition of a Skitter-Wight infant specifically, but by a broader chemical and behavioral signature. Total physical vulnerability, combined with an absence of any defensive or aggressive posturing, combined with direct, sustained, trusting proximity. A Skitter-Wight's hunting instinct is triggered by fear, Dr. Kessler-Namdi explained, in the documentary interview that would eventually make her one of the most recognizable xenobiologists in the Reach. Fear has a scent. Prey animals produce it involuntarily the moment they perceive themselves to be in danger, and a Skitter-Wight's entire nervous system is essentially built around detecting and pursuing that scent with total, single-minded focus. But Mila Whitcomb-Osei walked into that shed and sat down in front of a wounded apex predator without one single trace of fear in her body chemistry. She wasn't being brave. She was 3. She genuinely did not understand on any level that she was supposed to be afraid. And a creature whose entire predatory, chasing fear simply had no framework at all for what to do with a creature that wasn't producing any, denied the one signal its hunting instinct required, and presented instead with the precise combination of total vulnerability and total trust that had spent millions of years wiring itself directly into the species' parental care behavior. The Skitter-Wight's nervous system had done something no simulation, no lab test, and no field observation had ever previously documented. It had, in the clinical language Dr. Kessler-Namdi would eventually use in her published findings, reclassified the child, not as prey, not as threat, as pack. I want to pause the story right here because we're about to get into the part where the colony has to decide what to do about a healed, fully mobile apex predator that has apparently decided a toddler is its responsibility now. And I always forget the housekeeping until we're already 3 chapters deep. If this story's got its hooks in you, if you're already picturing an 800-kilogram nightmare with claws very carefully holding a rubber duck in its jaws, go ahead and hit that like button. It's a small thing on your end, and it genuinely helps stories like this one reach more people, which is the only reason I get to keep making them. If you're new to the channel, there's a subscribe button right there, and a whole archive of stories in a similar vein. Apex predators, impossible bonds, the occasional interstellar diplomatic incident caused entirely by a stubborn toddler. I'd love to have you stick around for those. And if you've got a guess about how the colony handles this or a pet of your own that's decided you belong to it rather than the other way around, the comments are open, and I read every single one. Okay, back to Halcyon's Rest. Because the colony's security chief still has to make a decision, and not everyone on that committee is going to agree with Dr. Kessler-Namdi's theory. The emergency session of the Halcyon's Rest Colonial Safety Committee convened 4 days after the initial encounter, in a meeting hall packed well past its normal capacity with colonists who had, over those 4 days, watched a genuine miracle unfold in their own supply shed, and were not, as a body, prepared to watch it end in an execution. Otieno Vasquez Lindqvist, still bound by the letter of every safety protocol he had spent his career enforcing, opened the session with the argument he genuinely believed, on a professional level, was correct. I understand what everyone has seen on the footage, he said, standing at the front of the packed hall, his voice carrying the particular strain of a man arguing against his own instincts. I understand it looks like affection. I understand it looks like loyalty. But this is still biologically an animal capable of killing every person in this room before anyone could reach the door. We do not have a behavioral track record spanning more than 4 days. We have one incident. One. I am not willing to bet this colony's safety on the theory that a predator's entire evolutionary programming has been permanently overwritten by a single encounter with one child, no matter how compelling the footage is. Daniel Whitcomb Osei, Mila's father, stood up before the committee chair had even finished acknowledging him. With respect, Otieno, I've watched that footage more times than anyone else in this room because it's my daughter in it, he said, his voice rough with 4 sleepless nights. And I understand the risk better than anyone here because I'm the one who has to decide whether to let my 3-year-old anywhere near that shed again. But I've also watched, 4 separate times now, my daughter try to sneak back to that shed against direct instructions, and every single time, that animal has done nothing but position itself between her and the door, watching for me, watching for anyone, the same way it watched you the day you found them together. If it wanted to hurt her, Otieno, it has had 4 days and roughly 40 opportunities. It hasn't taken a single one. Dr. Kessler-Namdi, given the floor next, laid out her preliminary cross-species denning response theory in careful, deliberately unembellished terms, emphasizing at every turn the limits of what 4 days of data could actually confirm. I want to be honest with this committee about what I don't know, she said. I don't know if this bond is permanent. I don't know if it will hold under stress, under threat, under any circumstance more dangerous than a game of fetch in a storage shed. What I do know is that everything about this animal's behavior over the last 4 days is consistent with an extremely powerful, evolutionarily ancient parental care instinct that has, for reasons we're only beginning to understand, redirected itself onto a human child. That's not a guess born of hope. That's a pattern observed and logged, consistent with a species-level trait we already knew existed, and simply never expected to see triggered this way. The vote, when it finally came, was close, 6-5 in favor of what the committee's final resolution termed a conditional, closely monitored cohabitation trial, with the explicit understanding that any deviation from the Skitter-Wight's demonstrated non-aggressive behavior, however minor, would result in immediate, non-negotiable termination of the trial. Vasquez Lindqvist, who had voted against the resolution, was nonetheless the one who volunteered to install and personally monitor the sensor array that would track the creature's behavior around the clock for the following 6 months. I don't have to agree with a decision to make sure it's done as safely as possible, he told the committee, and nobody in the room doubted him for a second. The 6 months that followed produced, according to Dr. Kessler-Namdi's eventual published dataset, over 4,000 hours of continuous behavioral observation, the single largest sustained record of Skitter-Wight behavior ever compiled, and the first to document in exhaustive, methodical detail exactly what the species looked like when it wasn't hunting. The colony named the creature, somewhat inevitably, after the toy that had started everything. Mila had taken to calling it Duck within the first week, with the specific, unshakable logic of a toddler who had decided a name was a name regardless of how poorly it fit. And by the end of the trial period, the name had stuck so thoroughly that even the official Xenobiology Consolidated Registry entry, when it was eventually filed, included subject designation, Duck, informal, as a permanent footnote. Duck's hind limb, treated with a combination of colonial veterinary supplies and no small amount of improvisation on Dr. Kessler-Namdi's part, healed fully within the first 6 weeks, restoring the animal to complete mobility, and, with it, restoring every single one of the physical capabilities that had made it the terror of the Orion Reach in the first place. It could, at any point after that 6th week, have left the colony entirely. The perimeter fence, as Vasquez Lindqvist grimly noted more than once, would have posed no more obstacle to a fully healed Skitter-Wight than a strong breeze. It did not leave. Instead, over the following months, Duck settled into a routine that Dr. Kessler and Namdi's field notes describe with a mixture of scientific rigor and open, unconcealed astonishment. It slept, when it slept at all, curled in a tight, watchful coil directly outside the Whitcomb-Osei family's front door, positioned in a way that gave it clear sight lines down both approaches to the house. It accompanied Mila, at a respectful but unwavering distance, on every outdoor excursion her parents permitted, adjusting its position constantly and apparently instinctively to keep itself between the child and whatever direction posed the greatest theoretical risk: the colony's perimeter fence, the unpaved service road, the steep drainage ditch behind the school that every parent in the settlement had been nagging the administration to fence off for years. It tolerated with what Dr. Kessler-Namdi's notes describe as a patience bordering on the biologically implausible, an extraordinary range of toddler-administered indignities. It was dressed on multiple documented occasions in an assortment of Mila's stuffed animal accessories, including a small knitted hat that had to be specially resized to fit over one of its sensory ridges. It was instructed with complete 3-year-old sincerity in the rules of at least 4 different invented games, none of which it could possibly have understood, all of which it participated in with what onlookers repeatedly described as visible, if alien, enthusiasm. It allowed its formidable mandibular claws, the same claws that had sheared through reinforced titanium in a materials lab 3 systems away, to be used, at Mila's specific and repeated insistence, as a jungle gym. The one behavior that never wavered, across the entire 6-month trial, was its response to anything the sensor logs classified as a potential threat to the child. On one occasion, a startled brush runner pack broke from cover near the school playground during recess, sending several children scattering in a genuine screaming panic. Duck crossed the intervening 30 meters in under 2 seconds, placing itself bodily between the fleeing children and the animals before a single teacher had even registered what was happening, and held that position utterly motionless until the brush runners had retreated and every child had been accounted for. On another occasion, the one that would eventually convince even the committee's most hesitant holdouts, a maintenance drone malfunctioned during a routine perimeter sweep and veered, engine sparking, directly toward the section of playground where Mila was climbing on a low equipment frame. Duck did not hesitate, did not calculate, did not appear to weigh any option beyond the single one available to it. It intercepted the drone at full speed, took the resulting impact and small electrical fire across its own armored flank without so much as a change in posture, and had the wreckage pinned and smoldering beneath one enormous forelimb before the drone's automated shutdown protocol had even finished executing. Otieno Vasquez Lindqvist, reviewing the footage afterward, is on record as saying only, "Well, I suppose that settles that." Not everyone who encountered the arrangement at Halcyon's Rest during those 6 months was as easily persuaded as its own colonists, who had, after all, spent months watching the evidence accumulate day by day, incident by incident, until skepticism simply became unsustainable. The outside world did not have that luxury of gradual exposure, and nowhere was that gap more apparent than in the visit, 4 months into the trial, of a Frontier Colonial Safety Board field inspector named Reginald Achebe Torres. Achebe Torres arrived on Halcyon's Rest with explicit instructions to conduct an independent assessment of the cohabitation trial, and in his own words to the colony's administration upon arrival, very likely recommend its immediate termination, because I have read 40 years of Skitter-Wight incident reports and I do not believe 6 months of good behavior undoes 4 decades of evidence. He was not, by his own later admission, an unreasonable man, merely a cautious one, and the colony's administration, mindful that his report would carry considerable weight with the wider safety board, arranged for him to observe the arrangement directly rather than relying solely on submitted footage, which he had, not unreasonably suggested, might have been selectively edited. What Achebe Torres witnessed over his 3-day visit did not immediately change his mind. He watched, with visible and undisguised tension, as Duck accompanied Mila to the colony's small playground, positioning himself at what the inspector's own notes describe as an unnervingly precise distance, never crowding the child, never losing sight of her, adjusting position continuously in a way that reads, uncomfortably, like tactical awareness, rather than mere fondness. He interviewed Vasquez Lindqvist at length, pressing repeatedly on the security chief's own initial skepticism, searching, by his own later admission, for some crack in the colony's collective conviction that he could use to justify the recommendation he had arrived already intending to make. The moment that changed his assessment came on the second evening of his visit, entirely without warning and entirely without any input from the colony's administration, who had not staged it and could not have staged it if they'd tried. Achebe Torres, walking back to his guest quarters after a long day of interviews, took a wrong turn in the unfamiliar settlement and found himself, without meaning to, approaching the Whitcomb-Osi residence from an unfamiliar angle, at a pace and posture that, combined with the low evening light and his entirely innocent unfamiliarity with the property's layout, apparently registered, to Duck's threat assessment instincts, as something worth investigating. "I want to be extremely clear," Achebe Torres wrote in his subsequent report, "that at no point did the animal behave with anything approaching aggression toward me. It rose from where it had been resting near the doorway, positioned itself, smoothly, without haste, without any vocalization I would characterize as threatening, directly between myself and the door, and simply waited, watching me, until I had identified myself and altered my course. It did not growl. It did not bear any part of its considerable natural armament. It communicated, through posture alone, precisely one piece of information, that I was welcome to be present, but not welcome to proceed any further without explanation. The moment I stepped back and spoke, badly I'll admit, my voice shaking rather more than I would like to record officially, it relaxed, in every visible respect, and returned to its resting position by the door." Achebe Torres's final report to the safety board, submitted a week later, reversed his own stated intentions entirely. It recommended not termination but continuation of the trial, under Dr. Kessler Namdi's ongoing supervision, accompanied by a personal note that would later be quoted with his permission in several of the follow-up publications. "I have spent 11 years reading reports about what this species does to people," he wrote. "I have never once in that time read a report about what this species will do for people, because until Halcyon's rest, nobody had ever documented the possibility that such a thing existed. I came here fully prepared to end this trial. I am recommending instead that we learn everything we possibly can from it, because I believe, and I do not say this lightly, that we have been wrong about a fundamental piece of this species' nature for 40 years, and the cost of that error, going forward, is a cost I am no longer willing to let stand uncorrected. If the story ended there, a wounded predator, a fearless child, 6 peaceful months of playground fetch and jungle gym claws, it would already be, by any measure, one of the strangest and most heartening entries in the frontier colonial record. But the event that finally permanently settled every remaining doubt about Duck's loyalty came 7 months into the trial, on a night that nearly ended Halcyon's rest entirely. The threat that arrived that night was not another Skitter-Wight, and it was not, in fact, any predator the colony's threat assessments had ever ranked as a serious concern for a settlement this far from the Reach's more dangerous outer bands. It was a void cull swarm, a migratory species of small, ferociously coordinated pack hunters, individually far less dangerous than a Skitter-Wight, but capable, in sufficiently large numbers, of overwhelming, even well-defended positions through sheer relentless volume. A swarm of this size had not been recorded within 300 kilometers of Halcyon's rest in over a decade, and the colony's perimeter defenses, still, embarrassingly, only partially repaired after the earlier turret malfunction, were nowhere near prepared for what came pouring over the eastern fence line just after midnight. The colony's alarm system triggered within seconds of the first breach, and Vasquez-Lindqvist's security team responded with commendable speed. But a void cull swarm moves fast, low, and in numbers that make any conventional defensive line difficult to hold. And within minutes the swarm's forward elements had pushed nearly 200 meters inside the perimeter, directly toward the residential district where the Whitcomb-Osei family, along with several dozen other families, had their homes. Daniel Whitcomb-Osei would later describe the following several minutes as the worst of his life, and the ones he is simultaneously most grateful for. "I heard the alarm, and I ran straight for Mila's room," he said. "And by the time I got there, Duck was already at the window, and I mean already. I don't know how it knew before the alarm even finished its first cycle, but it knew. It didn't wait for instructions. It went straight through the window, glass and frame and everything, and it was already moving toward the fence line before I'd even gotten Mila into my arms." What followed, reconstructed from a combination of security footage, sensor logs, and the eyewitness accounts of no fewer than 11 colonists who watched some portion of it unfold, was later described by Dr. Kessler Namdi, in language uncharacteristically unscientific for her published work, as the single most ferocious display of defensive violence I have ever had the privilege of documenting. Duck met the leading edge of the void cull swarm alone, at the exact point where the residential district's outer perimeter met open ground, and held that position for the better part of 11 minutes. The same 11 minutes, colonists would later note with a certain grim symmetry, that Mila had once spent alone in a storage shed with a wounded stranger. It fought with a controlled, economical brutality, entirely absent from its months of gentle domestic routine, its mandibular claws working with the same efficiency that had once shredded reinforced titanium, its infrared and echolocation senses tracking a dozen fast-moving targets simultaneously in total darkness. Colonists who reached the scene with what heavy weaponry the settlement possessed found themselves more than once simply providing covering fire around the edges of a fight Duck had already largely decided. By the time the swarm broke and scattered, void cull packs, for all their coordinated ferocity, will not sustain an assault against a target that refuses to yield ground, and Duck had refused, absolutely and without exception, to yield a single meter of the line it had chosen. The colony had suffered property damage, several serious injuries among the security team, and not one single fatality. The residential district, and every family inside it, remained untouched. Duck himself, the colony had by unspoken consensus long since stopped debating the creature's gender and simply settled on the pronoun that seemed to fit, was found afterward at the edge of the fence line, bleeding from a dozen shallow lacerations, one sensory ridge badly torn, standing guard over the perimeter with the same patient, unmovable posture Vasquez-Lindqvist had first seen in a storage shed doorway 7 months earlier. Mila, according to her father, would not be consoled or coaxed back to sleep until she had been carried out to the fence line herself, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, to personally inspect Duck's injuries and, with characteristic 3-year-old thoroughness, apply a liberal quantity of the family's medical antiseptic to every wound she could reach. "Does the orange stuff work on you?" she reportedly asked him, the same question she'd asked in the shed 7 months before. According to Daniel Whitcomb-Osei, Duck made the same low rhythmic clicking sound he had made that first day, and did not move an inch until every wound had been tended to his daughter's satisfaction. News of the void cull incident, and the full sensor record of the 7 months preceding it, spread through the frontier colonial network with a speed that Dr. Kessler Namdi's earlier, more measured publications had never achieved. The story reached other colonies, other systems, and eventually the wider scientific establishment of the consolidated xenobiology community, which had spent 40 years treating the Skitter-Wight's threat classification as essentially permanent and unquestionable. It was not the sentimentality of the story that ultimately shifted institutional opinion. Dr. Kessler Namdi has been quick, in every interview since, to note that a single colony's experience with a single individual does not, on its own, constitute grounds for revising an entire species' threat classification. It was the data. 4,000 hours of continuous behavioral observation, a documented, physiologically consistent trigger mechanism, a defensive engagement against a genuine threat, resolved without a single human casualty, by an animal that had 7 months earlier been scheduled for termination on site. The cross-species denning response theory initially met with significant skepticism from established xenobiologists who had spent their careers studying the Skitter-Wight purely as a threat to be managed, gradually found supporting evidence in a handful of previously unexplained field incidents across other frontier colonies. Isolated reports, dismissed for years as statistical noise or faulty observation, of Skitter-Wights behaving with uncharacteristic restraint around specific individuals under specific conditions. Dr. Kessler-Namdi's published framework gave researchers, for the first time, a coherent lens through which to re-examine that scattered, previously dismissed data. 3 additional colonies over the following 2 years would go on to document similar bonds under similarly controlled circumstances, none identical to Halcyon's Rest, but all consistent with the same underlying trigger: a vulnerable, fearless individual, an absence of any perceived threat signal, and sustained, trusting proximity during a period when the animal was itself vulnerable. None of the 3 subsequent cases involved a toddler. 2 involved elderly colonists with limited mobility, and 1, more improbably still, involved a colony's resident therapy animal, a blind elderly canine that had wandered, entirely by accident, into the same kind of encounter that had once played out in a storage shed on Halcyon's Rest. The first of these follow-up cases, documented on the frontier settlement of Corin's Landing roughly 14 months after the events at Halcyon's Rest, involved an elderly widower named Josiah Okafor Lindqvist, who had lived alone at the edge of the colony's perimeter for the better part of a decade following the loss of his wife. A young Skitter-Wight, driven from its territory by an aggressive rival, had taken shelter beneath his modest homestead during a severe storm, and Okafor Lindqvist, a man who had, by his own account, stopped being afraid of much of anything the day I buried my wife, had simply left food and water at the edge of his porch each evening rather than reporting the animal, on the theory, as he later put it, that anything hurting that badly deserved a chance to heal before anyone decided its fate for it. By the time colonial authorities became aware of the arrangement, the bond was already fully formed, and Dr. Kessler-Namdi, called in to consult, found a pattern of behavior: constant proximity, aggressive defense of the homestead's perimeter, and a documented willingness to tolerate physical contact no wild Skitter-Wight had ever previously permitted. That mirrored Duck's case closely enough to move cross-species denning response from theory to accepted, if still rare, documented phenomenon. The second case, on the mining settlement of Ashgrove Deep, proved considerably more consequential for policy purposes, precisely because it involved circumstances the safety board could not simply attribute to the particular, perhaps irreproducible chemistry between one predator and one child. An elderly resident named Temperance Achterberg Diallo, confined to a mobility chair following a mining accident years earlier, had spent months quietly, deliberately cultivating a relationship with an injured Skitter-Wight discovered near the settlement's outer excavation site, following, almost point for point, the same behavioral protocol Dr. Kessler-Namdi had by then published as guidance: patient, unhurried proximity, an absence of any defensive or threat posturing, and the simple, sustained presence of someone the animal could not possibly perceive as prey. The fact that Achterberg Diallo had, unlike the original Halcyon's Rest encounter, acted deliberately and with full knowledge of the research that preceded her, gave the safety board exactly the reproducibility evidence it needed to formalize its revised protocols rather than treating Duck's case as an unrepeatable fluke. The Frontier Colonial Safety Board did not remove the Skitter-Wight from its threat registry. Dr. Kessler-Namdi herself argued strenuously against any such reclassification, noting correctly that the vast majority of the species' population remained exactly as dangerous and exactly as unpredictable as it had always been. What the board did add, in a revision that Dr. Kessler-Namdi still considers the proudest achievement of her career, was an entirely new protocol category: guidance for colonial security teams on identifying and, where safely possible, cultivating exactly the conditions that had produced Duck, rather than defaulting immediately and irreversibly to termination in every encounter with an isolated, non-aggressive individual. "We didn't turn a predator into a pet," Dr. Kessler Namdi said, in the closing lines of the documentary that would eventually bring this story to audiences well beyond the Orion Reach. That framing has always made me a little uncomfortable, honestly, because it suggests we did something to him, that we tamed something wild and made it small and safe and ours. That's not what happened. Duck is still, by every physical measure, exactly the same animal that terrified 6 colonies for 40 years. What changed wasn't the predator. What changed was that for one afternoon in a storage shed, a 3-year-old girl gave him a reason to be something else, and he took it, and he never once looked back. Mila Whitcomb-Ossie is 9 years old at the time of this account's most recent update, and Duck, now formally logged in the Xenobiology Consolidated Registry as the first confirmed and permanently monitored case of cross-species denning response in Kralathex voronmalu, remains exactly where he has been for the better part of 6 years, within arm's reach of her, more often than not, in whatever configuration the day's activities require. He walks her to school each morning, a routine the colony's other children long ago stopped finding remarkable, positioned at her side with the same watchful, adjusting posture that once guarded a storage shed doorway. He waits, according to the school's official, and occasionally exasperated records, directly outside her classroom window for the duration of every school day, a presence the school's newer teachers are invariably warned about well in advance, and one that the school's longer-serving staff have come to regard, without exception, as the single most effective truancy and safety deterrent the settlement has ever had. Otieno Vasquez Lindqvist, still the colony's security chief, keeps a framed still image from the original shed footage on his office wall, the exact frame showing Duck's head lowered, jaws closed with impossible gentleness around a chewed yellow toy, beneath a small brass plate that reads in its entirety, "Sometimes the data is wrong. Check anyway." Dr. Amara Kessler Namdi still visits Halcyon's Rest twice a year, ostensibly for continued behavioral monitoring, though her field notes from recent visits have grown noticeably less clinical and considerably more personal over time. Her most recent entry, dated from her latest visit, reads simply, "Subject remains at post. Subject remains, in every observable respect, exactly as devoted as the day this began. I have run out of scientific language for what that means to me, so I will simply write it down plainly. Some bonds once formed do not require an explanation to be real. This is one of them." Mila, when asked by the documentary crew what she thought at 9 years old about the fact that she had once walked fearlessly up to the most dangerous predator in the Orion Reach and offered it a chewed rubber duck, considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness she had once applied to a game of fetch in a storage shed. "I didn't know he was dangerous," she said. "I just knew he was hurt and nobody was helping him, so I helped him." A pause, and a small, characteristically stubborn shrug. "I still don't really think he's dangerous. Everyone else does. I think he's just Duck." Somewhere just outside the frame of that final interview, according to the documentary's own footage, an 800-kilogram apex predator capable of shredding reinforced titanium with its bare claws sat perfectly, patiently still, watching over her with exactly the same quiet, unwavering attention he had offered from the very first day. Proof, if proof were ever needed, that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy and the most loyal thing in the galaxy have never, in the end, been mutually exclusive. The documentary crew, packing up their equipment at the end of that final day of filming, asked Dr. Kessler Namdi one last question, almost as an afterthought, on their way out the door. Whether she thought, given everything she now knew, the original decision to spare Duck's life in that storage shed had been the right one. She considered it for a long moment, the same careful, unhurried consideration she brought to every question in her professional life, before answering. "I think about that vote a lot," she said. 6-5. One person's hesitation either way and none of this happens. Duck is euthanized in a storage shed before he's ever fully healed. Mila grows up never knowing there was anything unusual about that week at all. And an entire species stays exactly as feared and exactly as misunderstood as it had been for 40 years before. I don't think we got lucky, exactly. I think a 3-year-old girl who didn't know how to be afraid, gave a wounded animal a single chance to be something other than what everyone assumed it had to be, and enough people around her were willing, however reluctantly, to let that chance stand. That's not luck. That's just what happens when you leave a little room for the data to surprise you. She glanced as she said it toward the window, where Duck's watchful shape was still visible in the afternoon light. I'd like to think we'd do the same thing again. I hope we never have to find out the hard way whether that's true. That's the story of Duck and Mila Whitcomb-Ossie, one of the strangest and, honestly, one of my favorite entries in the whole Frontier record. If it got you, if you found yourself rooting for an 800-kilogram nightmare with claws by the end of it, the like button's still right there and it makes a genuine difference. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. There are plenty more strange, stubborn, impossible bonds out there in the Reach waiting to be told. And let me know in the comments what you'd have named him, because between you and me, I don't think Duck is ever getting overruled at this point, no matter how many committee meetings they hold.